Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Welcome back, young friends, and everyone joining for the Gradual teaching series. We are continuing to look at the Buddha's gradual instructions on the heavenly realms. In our last session, we looked at most of the rūpa-loka, the heavenly realms of form. And the last part is really to look at the heavenly realms of form that are comprised of the suddhavasa, the pure abodes. And today we're looking in particular at non-returners and these pure abodes. So what we can say is that these are the Arya Bhumi. These are the realms or planes where only noble ones dwell. And they're considered the 5 highest heavenly realms of form. But not only that, in samsara they're also considered very high because only noble ones reside there. So only non-returners, Anägämis, those who have developed the 4th jhana and other spiritual faculties and powers and things like that, but they are the beings that have developed the 3rd stage of awakening, so path and fruit of a non-returner, and they're the only ones that really take rebirth in these realms. They are born spontaneously, particularly from the Deva realms into the pure abodes. So what we know is that they will never fall back. So once you take rebirth into these pure abodes, they will never go back to lower realms. So Buddha speaks very highly about beings who are able to be born into the pure abodes because you've actually stemmed the tide of coming back to samsara and to lower realms. And so you see out the rest of your life, your very long existence in these pure abodes, until you realize Nibbana, and then you pass away from any one of these 5 pure abodes. So what we know is that only Anägämis are born there, but there are also arahants who live there, so those that have realized Nibbana but haven't passed away yet. So very, very special places. The noble ones who dwell in the pure abodes have very long lifespans, and we see references to them throughout the suttas in terms of interacting with different beings in other realms, other devas, and also with the Buddha. And we also find that the Buddha visits the suddhavasa, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. The first of the realms is known as aviha, so devas not falling away, durable devas. And it's associated with not falling back to the lower realms, not falling away. So the lifespan is up to 1,000 mahakapas, and this is one of the realms where we find a lot of interaction. So we'll have some stories and look at certain people from the time of the Buddha that were reborn into aviha. There's also one category of Anägämi, non-returners, where they begin when they're born into aviha and they make their way up to akanita, where they realize Nibbana and then pass away from there. The second is known as Athapa, the untroubled devas or serene devas, and their name derives from being unworried or having serenity, and their lifespan is up to 2,000 mahakapas. The third of the realms is Suddasa Deva. So these are the beautiful devas, and the name derives from seeing well, and their lifespan is up to 4,000 mahakapas. Then we have the Suddasi devas. They're known as the clear-sighted devas, and their name derives from easily seen, and their lifespan is up to 8,000 mahakapas. And the last of the pure abodes is known as the akanita devas, peerless devas. So their name derives from being not junior. So essentially they are the most senior, with a lifespan of up to 16,000 mahakapas. Now, what's very apparent is that the akanita devas are the most high. If you think about beings with the most wisdom, greatness, they're the ones that are inhabiting the akanita deva realm. And there's reference in the Abhidhamma that the spiritual faculties are actually linked to where you are reborn and dwell in terms of these pure abodes. So what it says, and we don't fully understand whether this is what this means or whether this is actually the case. But what it says is that aviha is associated with satta. And what we'll see is when we look at Hatthaka of Alavi, one of the very noble lay disciples of the Buddha who was reborn into aviha, that his saddha, his conviction towards Buddha Dhamma Sangha is very strong. So there might be something to this. In terms of atapa, the spiritual faculty that is most strong is virya, the energy or the effort. And suttas, it's the sati indriya, so the spiritual faculty associated with mindfulness. And then suddasi, Deva realm, is associated with the samadhi indriya, so the faculty associated with concentration. And then akanita is the last in terms of the panya indriya, so the indriya, the spiritual faculty that is associated with wisdom. And I think as we get to understand some of these realms, or even collectively, that maybe some of that rings quite true. And so we must have a lot of respect for those that are residing in the pure abodes, because this is the Arya Bhumi, the plains or the realms where only noble ones reside, those that have been walking the Noble Eightfold Path, who are dwelling there. And we'll learn that there is teaching that happens in these pure abodes. As we saw in some of the heavenly realms of form, in terms of the lower ones, there is teaching that is done there, but clearly also in the pure abodes, there is a lot of teaching there, and their faculties are sharper, and the enlightenment factors, so the 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas, they have come together for these beings. And so if one were to learn the Dhamma from the beings of the pure abodes, particularly the arahants who reside there, who haven't passed away yet, then that is a very, very fortunate and blessed thing. We learn of the Buddha's visit to the pure abodes, the Suddhavasa, in the Mahapadana Sutta. This is Digha Nikaya, discourse number 14. So this is one of the longer discourses of the Buddha. Now what's interesting about this discourse is that the Buddha goes into detail about one particular Buddha, which is known as Vipassi Buddha, but also the other Buddhas prior to him. And we learn a great deal of things about the time of those Buddhas. But at the end, he talks about his visit to each of the pure abodes. And so we learn more about the beings who inhabit those abodes, but the important role that they play in information that they have, and also to the number of Buddhas that they have previously listened to before. So these are beings who have listened to not just one Buddha, but many, many Buddhas. Even that idea is quite amazing. So let's read a little bit about the Buddha's visit to the pure abodes and what he says in this sutta. It begins by saying, "At one time, bhikkhus, I was staying near Ukatta in the Subhaga forest at the root of a magnificent sal tree. As I was in private retreat, this thought came to mind. It's not easy to find an abode of sentient beings where I haven't previously abided in all this long time, except for the devas of the pure abodes. Why don't I go and see them? Then, as easily as a strong person would extend or contract their arm, I vanished from Subhaga forest and reappeared with the devas of the Aviha realm." So let's just pause here for one moment, because there's something very interesting about the Buddha said. He said that he hasn't previously dwelled in the devas of the pure abodes. Now what we can understand about that is that bodhisattvas are not reborn into these pure abodes. And we can understand this in the fact that if he was reborn as a bodhisattva into the pure abodes, he wouldn't be able to fall back. So that means he wouldn't be able to come back and be reborn into the human realm or any of those other realms that are below the pure abodes. And so that wouldn't work if one is training to become the Buddha. That's very interesting. The second interesting thing is that it's very easy for him to have the thought that he wants to go somewhere, and then he reappears in that realm, which is what he has done when he's reappeared in the Viha realm. So these are his supernormal powers. Then it goes on. In that order of devas, so he's in the Aviha realm, many thousands, many hundreds of thousands of deities approached me, bowed, stood to one side, and said to me, 91 eons ago, good sir, the Buddha Vipassi arose in the world, perfected and fully awakened. He was born into a family of the ruling class. Kondanya was his clan. He lived for 80,000 years. He was awakened at the root of a trump flower tree. He had a fine pair of disciples named Kanda and Tissa. He had 3 gatherings of disciples, one of 6,800,000, one of 100,000, and one of 80,000. All of them bhikkhus who had ended their defilements. He had as a chief attendant a bhikkhu named Asoka. His father was King Baduma. His birth mother was Queen Bandumati, and their capital city was named Bandumati. And such was his renunciation, such his going forth, such his striving, such his awakening, and such his rolling forth of the wheel of Dhamma. And good sir, after leading the spiritual life under that Buddha Vipassi, we lost our desire for sensual pleasures and were reborn here. So that's very, very interesting, because they're telling him so many details about who were the chief disciples and who were the parents of that Buddha, and giving an account. So they have a lot of information. The other thing that we learn is that there are many hundreds and thousands of them. What's interesting about that is often people think that these realms are empty before the coming of the Buddha. But if you recall, they have very long lifespans, and so they are still dwelling there, even in the in-between, before when one Buddha passes away and then the coming of another Buddha. And so they are still residing there, living and teaching and doing various things, very wholesome things in between. So there are hundreds of thousands of Anägämis and arahants who live even in the Viha realm, is what we're hearing. So it goes on to say, and other deities came and similar recounted the details of the Buddha's Sikhi, Besabu, Kakusanda, Konagamana, and Kassapa. In that order of devas, many hundreds of deities approached me, bowed, stood to one side, and said to me, in the present fortunate eon, good sir, you have arisen in the world, perfected and fully awakened. You were born, and then it goes on to say very similar things. And then it goes on to say, then together with the Aviha devas, I went to see the Atapa devas. Then after that, the Suttas devas, and then the Suddasi devas. Then together with all these devas, I went to see the Akanita devas, where we had a similar conversation. And that is how the Enlightened One is able to recollect the caste, names, clans, lifespan, chief disciples, and gatherings of disciples of the Buddhas of the past who have become completely extinguished, cut off proliferation, cut off the track, finished off the cycle, and transcended suffering. It is both because I have clearly comprehended the principle of the teachings, and also because the deities told me. So what's really interesting about this is it's both because the Buddha clearly comprehends the Dhamma himself, but also because the noble beings in these realms also tell him. So there's a very unique relationship that exists between the Anägämis and arahants of the pure abodes, and also with the Buddha. We saw in the Mahapadana Sutta the Buddha's visit to the noble ones in the pure abodes, and we saw the amount of respect that they have for the Buddha, even despite listening to many other Buddhas in the past, and also their wisdom and knowledge and fruits of their practice. And the relationship with the Buddha is one of great respect. And so it's interesting when you read different suttas that you find that they also have a great deal of respect for the Sangha, the ones that are practicing towards liberating themselves. And you find one particular account in the Mahasamaya Sutta. So this is again in Digha Nikaya, discourse number 20. It's a longer discourse. And the Buddha and a large Sangha are actually gathering in the woods. And there are deities who've come from many world systems to come and gather around the Buddha and the Sangha. And so it opens with 4 noble beings coming from the Suddhavasa to actually pay respects to the Sangha. So it begins by saying, so I have heard, at one time the Buddha was staying in the land of the Sakyans near Kaplavatu in the Great Wood, together with a large Sangha of around 500 bhikkhus, all of whom were perfected ones. So all of them were arahants. and most of the deities from 10 solar systems had gathered to see the Buddha and Sangha of bhikkhus. Then 4 deities of the pure abodes, aware of what was happening, thought, why don't we go to the Buddha and each recite a verse in his presence? Then, as easily as a strong person would extend or contract their arm, they vanished from the pure abodes and reappeared in front of the Buddha. They bowed to the Buddha and stood to one side. Standing to one side, one deity recited this verse in the Buddha's presence. There's a great congregation in the woods. A host of devas have assembled. We've come to this righteous congregation to see the invincible Sangha. Then another deity recited this verse in the Buddha's presence. The bhikkhus there are immersed in samadhi. They've straightened out their minds. Like a charioteer who has taken the reins, the astute ones protect their senses. Then another deity recited this verse in the Buddha's presence. Having cut the stake and cut the bar, they've unstirred, with boundary pillar uprooted. They live pure and immaculate, the young dragons tamed by the seer. Then another deity recited this verse in the Buddha's presence. Anyone who has gone to the Buddha for refuge won't go to a plane of loss. After giving up this human body, they swell the hosts of devas. So it's a very lovely sutta in terms of this opening that we've just read out, because you can see the reverence that they have for those that have attained arahantship, who have liberated themselves, but also what they lean towards in terms of their practice, guarding their faculties, immersing in concentration, taking refuge in the Buddha, all these different things. I think what's quite remarkable is that they can travel just as easy as the Buddha can, that if they have a thought that they want to go somewhere, they go. And they also are demonstrating that ability. But in addition to that, just the amount of profound respect that they have for Buddha and the Sangha. And that's very heartwarming to see and to read, but also to know that when you walk this path, you are actually all walking together, as are we doing. And so you see that coming out in the suttas when you read it. So when you read, the mind really uplifts when you think about these devas, these noble beings in the pure abodes. When we talk about the noble ones of the pure abodes, we're really talking about noble individuals, Arya Pugala, but specifically non-returners and arahants. And usually the question is asked around non-returners. And so it's good to look at a few suttas that help us to understand who and what they are. So the Karma Yoga Sutta is what we'll begin with, which is Itivuttaka 96. And it broadly says, bhikkhus, one bound by the bond of sensual desire and by the bond of being is a returner, one who comes back to this state. One freed from the bond of sensual desire, but still bound by the bond of existence, is a non-returner, one who does not come back to this state. One freed from the bond of sensual desire and freed from the bond of existence is an arahant, one in whom the taints are destroyed. So what the Buddha is referencing here is about craving. So craving for sensual desire and craving for existence in some form or another. And so the worldling, or those that haven't attained to the non-return, they're the ones that are still bound to come back, because they still have desire for sensual pleasures, still have desire to exist. But when it comes to the non-returner, the Buddha is saying that they are freed from sensual desire. So that means you won't be reborn into lower realms or realms where you wish for sensual desire. So there are some, as we know, heavenly realms that are sensual, so you're not bound to any of those. And so non-returner is reborn is because they still have craving for existence. And so that's something, once they're born into the pure abodes, they realize the truth and then they can awaken from there. And then of course the last part to the Karma Yoga Sutta is saying about the arahant who's freed of both those bonds and more actually, because all that craving, all the things that are binding you to samsara, they've actually uprooted, destroyed. So the second sutta that we can look at is the Pathama Pugala Sutta, so Anguttara Nikaya chapter 8, discourse number 59. And so what it says in broad terms, the Buddha says, the one who has entered the stream, the one who has entered into the course for the realization of the fruit of stream entry, the once returner, the one who has entered upon the course for the realization of fruit, of once returning. The non-returner, the one who has entered upon the course for the realization of the fruit of non-returning. The arahant, the one who has entered upon the course for arahantship. So this has a slightly different take on it, but it's talking about path and fruit of all these different noble individuals. And of course, the one when it comes to non-returner is the one who's entered into the course for the realization of the fruit of non-returning. And there's various different things that the Buddha talks about when it comes to fetters, when it comes to defilements. And so when you think of it as a gradual and progressive path that we are undertaking in accordance with the Buddha's instructions, then you are slowly but surely chipping away, wearing out defilements, and you bear the fruit of having done that by following the Buddha's good instructions, by meditating, by seeing through the things that we are wrongly taking delight in. In that last sutta, the Buddha was really talking about the 4 stages of awakening, so path and fruit of a stream enterer, path and fruit of a once returner, and path and fruit of a non-returner, and finally path and fruit of an arahant. The other way that the Buddha talks about entering the stream and realizing all the way up to Nibbana is by looking at what is destroyed, what is broken, and that is the 10 fetters. So these are known in Pali as Sangyojana. So the 10 fetters are personal existence view, in Pali that is Sakkaya Ditthi, doubt, which is Vicikicca, misapprehension of virtue and observances is the 3rd, which is Silabbata Paramasa, sensual desire, which is Kamacchando, and ill will, which is Vyapada. So these first 5 are known as the lower fetters. Then the last 5 are called the higher fetters, and that is lust for form, which is Rupa-raga, lust for the formless, Arupa-raga, conceit, which is Mana, restlessness, which is Uddhacca, and finally you have ignorance, which is Avijja. So those are known as the 5 higher fetters. So when we talk about fetters, which is Sangyojana, we're really talking about something that shackles you to samsara, something that binds you so that you keep coming back. So when you uproot or you destroy the fetters, what happens is you are breaking free of them. You're no longer shackled. And so that's a very good thing. So in respect of the stream enterer, what the Buddha says is that one has destroyed the first 3 fetters, so personal existence view, doubt, and misapprehension of virtue and observances. So it's really correcting the view around existence. It's really correcting any misapprehension about perfect sila, perfect virtue, or observing certain things which are more cultural, or some sort of belief that makes you think if you do this thing you'll end up awakened, which is not the case, because Buddha actually says the only way out is the Noble Eightfold Path. Then when it comes to doubt, primarily this kind of doubt about Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, doubt about the way out of suffering being the Noble Eightfold Path. So this is the first 3. So when you're a stream enterer, you've actually destroyed those first 3. Now when you become a once returner, like you've developed the path to realize path and fruit of a once returner, you don't destroy any more fetters, but you have destroyed more of the gross defilements, so things associated with greed, hatred, and delusion. So you're chipping away at certain defilements. But when it comes to the Anägämi, the non-returner, then you complete a further 2. So that means you've destroyed sensual desire, which is what we heard from that first sutta we read out, and then also ill will, which is the Vyapada. So those are the 5 in total that is destroyed for a non-returner. And then you destroy the final 5 when you realize Nibbana and become an arahant. So you realize path and fruit of an arahant. We learn about the different kinds of non-returners in the Padma-Vittara Sutta. This is Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 48, discourse number 15. And what's interesting is that these can be both lay people and monastics. And the Buddha goes to explain about the 5 spiritual faculties, the indriyas. So these are conviction, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. And what he says is that if you have completed and fully developed, fulfilled these 5 spiritual faculties, then you're an arahant. But if you're weaker than that, he speaks about 5 different instances which refer to non-returner. But if you're still weaker than that, then you are a once returner. If you're still weaker than that, then you're a stream enterer. If you're still weaker than that, a Dhamma follower. And then still weaker than that, a follower by conviction. So what essentially the Buddha is saying is that these 5 spiritual faculties, which make up part of the 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas, enlightenment factors, it's very, very important towards realizing Nibbana. So in terms of the non-returners, the first one is if you're an attainer of Nibbana in the interval. So that means you attain Nibbana when you're reborn into the pure abodes, but it's during the first half of that lifetime. The second is if you're weaker than that, then attain of Nibbana upon landing. So that means you're reborn into the pure abodes and you attain Nibbana in the second half of that lifetime. So it takes you a little bit longer. The third one is if you're still weaker than that, an attainer of Nibbana without exertion. So that means you attain Nibbana while you're in the pure abodes, but without much effort. Then the fourth is weaker than that if you're a attainer of Nibbana with exertion. So it takes a little bit more exertion once you're born into the pure abodes, so it takes a little longer. And then the last one is a non-returner who is bound upstream heading towards the Akanita realm. So that means you're born into the Viha pure abode, and then you gradually move towards the highest, which is the Akanita, and you attain Nibbana from there. So those are the 5 that the Buddha talks about. And we do have references to some lay people, monks and nuns, who have done it that particular way, the last way in the suttas. So we're going to look at a little bit of that. Before we look at specific individuals who are born into the pure abodes, let's look at this story of an Anägämi Thera, which appears in Eka Anägämi Thera Bhattu, which is Dhammapada verse 218. And what's interesting about this is it talks about the 5th category of a non-returner. So the story appears while the Buddha is staying at Jetavana Monastery, and the commentary tells us that this Anägämi Thera was a senior monk who had some students, and these students had actually asked about his attainments. And now he was already a non-returner, but he decided not to actually talk about his attainments to his students. He had made a resolution that he wouldn't talk about his attainments until he realized Nibbana, so path and fruit of an arahant. But he passed away before he realized Nibbana, and so he wasn't able to tell his students about his attainments. And so they were disappointed and they felt sorry for him, thinking that he hadn't attained anything. So they went to the Buddha, and the Buddha actually said to these students, Bhikkhus, the teacher was a Anägämi, a non-returner, before he passed away, and so now he's reborn into the pure abodes. And he didn't tell you because he had made a resolution that he wouldn't declare his attainments until he realized Nibbana. But your teacher is freed of the attachment to the sensual realm, so the rūpa-loka, and he will rise to the higher realm. So that's how we understand that he was born into a Viha and will make his way to Akanita eventually. So the Buddha then recites this verse, Chanda Jato Anakate, one with desire arisen for the undeclared. So the undeclared in this case means Nibbana. Manasa Chaputo Siya, whose mind is suffused, Kame Sucha Apatibada Chitto, not bound to sensual pleasures, is called going upstream, Udan Sototi Vuchati. What's important about this particular sutta is particularly about one's intention, one's chanda jato. So this word is desire risen or desire born of, or in some respects it's about one's zeal or endeavor. So when you have this very strong endeavor or desire, intention towards Nibbana, that is something that helps to infuse or suffuse the mind. It's a very wholesome state. So rather than focusing on sensual pleasures or other aspects of the world, one inclines in that way. And that's something for us to bear in mind, that when we talk about leaning towards Nibbana, when we talk about walking this path and have a very strong desire for Nibbana, it's a very wholesome thing. So what's very evident about this Anägämi Thera, what we can learn from him is that if we have noble intentions, such as the one that Anägämi Thera had, then we can also look forward to being reborn into the pure abodes. One of the lay disciples of the Buddha that we know about, who was reborn into a viha, is Hatthaka of Alavi. So there's a separate talk on Hatthaka of Alavi because he's one of the role models for lay people in terms of, particularly for sons, but everybody in terms of his qualities, his very noble qualities. Now, he was reborn into a viha, and the reason we know that is because there's a sutta that appears in Anguttara Nikaya, it's the Hatthaka Sutta. And he's a young deva, so he's a recent addition to the Aviha realm. And he comes to visit the Buddha, but he doesn't quite have a grasp on how to make his very, very subtle form into something that doesn't melt away. And so it's very interesting when he comes. So the sutta says, at one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jetha's grove, Anathapindika's monastery. Then late at night, the glorious Deva, Hatthaka, lighting up the entire Jetha's grove, went up to the Buddha thinking, I will stand before the Buddha, but he sank down and melted and wasn't able to stay still. It's like when ghee or oil is poured onto sand, it sinks and it melts down and it can't stay stable. So the Buddha says to Hatthaka, Hatthaka, manifest in solid form. So the Buddha clearly recognizes Hatthaka. And so Hatthaka says, yes, sir, and then he manifests into solid life form and bows to the Buddha and stands to one side. The Buddha then says, Hatthaka, I wonder whether you still rehearse now the teachings that you rehearsed when you were a human being. And Hatthaka's answer is very interesting. He says, I still rehearse now the teachings that I rehearsed as a human being. I also rehearse the teachings that I didn't rehearse as a human being. Just as the Buddha these days lives crowded by monks, nuns, laymen and laywomen, by rulers and their ministers and teachers of other paths and their disciples, so I live crowded by the devas. The devas come from far away thinking, we'll hear the teaching in the presence of Hatthaka. And then he goes on to say, sir, I passed away without getting enough of the three things. What three? Seeing the Buddha, hearing the true Dhamma, and serving the Sangha. I passed away without getting enough of these three things. I could never get enough of seeing the Buddha, serving the Sangha, or hearing the Dhamma. Training in the higher virtue, loving to hear the true Dhamma. Hatthaka has gone to a viha realm without getting enough of these three things. So there's a few things that are very important to pick up here. So the first thing is that this is how we learn that there are people that are teaching, there are noble beings that are teaching in these pure abodes. So Hatthaka is one of them. Also that he travels to see the Buddha, even in his state where he hasn't fully mastered manifesting in front of the Buddha. So that's also interesting. The second is that it's very crowded in these pure abodes. Sometimes people think they're empty, but they're actually very crowded. Lots of divine beings coming from all over to hear the Dhamma. And then also in terms of the Aviha realm, when we talked about potentially the spiritual faculty being aligned to these realms, it's quite clear in the case of Aviha that Hatthaka has so much saddha, so much conviction towards Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And so he says that he's gone to the Aviha realm because he didn't get enough of those things. So he didn't get enough of Buddha Dhamma Sangha. So something interesting about his example there. And so it's possible for lay people, I think this is the inspiring thing, it's possible for lay people practicing the Buddha's teachings, following his instructions, walking the Noble Eightfold Path, having the resolution to fully develop the Noble Path, can actually be reborn as a non-returner into a realm such as the Aviha realm. There are other lay disciples who are known to be non-returners. So you have Chitta the householder, Velukantaki, Queen Samavati. So these first three we've looked at separately in separate talks because they're very good role models for us. There's also Ugga of Vesali and Ugga of Hatigama. They're also non-returners. Visakha, husband of Dhammadina Theri. So if you remember the story of Dhammadina Theri, her husband actually realized non-return, and then he was teaching his wife, and eventually she ordained and she realized arahantship. Then we have the Sikh householders Sirivadda and Manadina, so they're also non-returners. And in the discourse about the Buddha's final passing, Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha is asked a question about the villages of Nadika. And so he gives specific names. We don't know who they are, but he says that over 50 laymen of Nadika also realize non-return. And it's interesting, in the Mahavacchagotta Sutta, which is in Majjhima Nikaya, discourse number 73, he's asked specific questions by Vacha about lay people and whether they attain path and fruit. And in relation to non-return, the Buddha says, there are not just 100 such celibate laymen and laywomen who are my disciples, Vacha, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 500, but many more than that, who, with the ending of the 5 lower fetters, is reborn spontaneously, to be extinguished there, not liable to return from that world. So whenever you read in the suttas the Buddha's reference to the ending of the 5 lower fetters, that is where the Buddha is talking about a non-returner. So what's very inspiring about all of this is that this may not be a complete list, but we know that there are many lay disciples who accomplished path and fruit of non-return. And so for us, it's inspiring to know that there are such people, but also to know that we don't know the specifics about where they are reborn, unlike with Hatthaka of Alavi, but some of them may be one of those 5. They may have been reborn spontaneously into the pure abodes and then realize very quickly full awakening, or it may have taken them a little longer. But in any case, these are non-returners. When we read the suttas, we recognize that many of the monks and nuns at the time of the Buddha, they actually realized full awakening. They realized Nibbana. And so it's very inspiring. But we also know from the suttas that there were others who had lesser attainments. And we use the word lesser not in a way to disrespect them, because being able to realize path and fruit at any of the stages is a wondrous thing. So there are accounts in the suttas such as Samyutta Nikaya chapter 1 discourse number 50, where Gatikara the potter, he comes to visit the Buddha. He's a deva that is in the Aviha realm, and he tells the Buddha about the monks that have come to the Aviha realm, that they've been reborn there. So there's the monks Upaka and Palaganda and Pukusati, and of course Badya, Badadeva, Bahudanti, and Pingya. So some of the names we know, some of the names we don't. But there's an interesting one about Pukusati. He was a young monk and he was staying at a potter's house. And the Buddha, with his divine eye or psychic abilities, could see what was about to happen to this young monk. And so he actually turned up to stay at the same guest house or potter's house where Venerable Pukusati was staying. And because of the guest rooms in the place, he asked whether he could share the room with Venerable Pukusati. Now, Venerable Pukusati did not recognize the Buddha at that time. But when they sat together in silence, the Buddha then preached the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta. So if some of you know, this is the discourse about the elements. So it's a very important and very famous teaching or sermon. So Pukusati recognized the Buddha at the end of the discourse, at the end of the teaching, and he begged his forgiveness for not having paid respects to him, not realizing that he was the Buddha. And so then he begged to have the Upasampada conferred on him. So what that means is he wants to be a fully ordained monk. At the time he must have been still a trainee monk. So the Buddha consented and sent him out to procure an alms bowl and also a robe. He went out to do so, but on the way, Venerable Pukusati, he was killed by a mad cow. And when this was reported to the Buddha said that Pukusati was an Anägämi, so he was a non-returner, and he'd been born in the Aviha realm. And so the Buddha also knew what Gatikara had actually also said about Venerable Pukusati being reborn in Aviha. So what's really interesting is sometimes you find these accounts in the suttas and they're quite fascinating to hear what has happened to them and the fact that they have ascended upwards. And so in your mind you think sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So we have another account about a nun called Nanda, and Buddha declared in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta that she had attained non-return, path and fruit of non-return, because she had ended the 5 lower fetters. So she had been reborn spontaneously, and he's confirmed that she will realize full awakening from there and not return to the world. So that's Digha Nikaya, discourse number 16, but you also find a separate sutta on that, and I think that's Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 55, discourse number 8. We have another account, and this is not exhaustive, so these are only a few examples of monks or nuns who have attained non-return. So we have the account of the Sikh monk Phalguna. This is from Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 6, discourse number 56. And his mind was freed from the 5 lower fetters when he was listening to a teaching of the Buddha. So he was quite sick, and the Buddha came to visit him, and he told the Buddha about all the painful feelings in the body, and he was lamenting and finding it very, very difficult. His mind was also finding it very, very difficult. And so the Buddha sat with him and then gave him a teaching. And while he was teaching, that is when Venerable Phalguna actually was released from the 5 lower fetters. He realized path and fruit of non-return. And so when he passed away, the Buddha confirmed that it was because he was listening to a teaching, listening to the Dhamma, that enabled him, despite being sick, to actually enter and also realize path and fruit of a non-returner. We can now take a little look at Ghattikara the potter, and we just briefly spoke about him when he came to see the Buddha and told the Buddha that these monks had been reborn in a viha. That's not to say that the Buddha didn't know already. The Buddha had different Buddha jnanas, different Buddha knowledges, but Ghattikara kindly came and stated that to the Buddha. We could infer that Ghattikara is actually dwelling in the Aviha realm. What we do know about Ghattikara, and if you know his story, it's quite a remarkable one, because his relationship with Kassapa Buddha, because he was born at the time of Kassapa Buddha, and that's the time that he attained path and fruit of the non-returner, he had a very, very wonderful relationship with him, and it's worthwhile looking at, but we won't look at it here. We'll do that as a separate talk, because there are certain things that are very good for us in terms of him being a role model. Also at the time, he had a relationship with the Bodhisattva Jyotipala, and Jyotipala, as we now know, became Gautama Buddha. So he also had a very interesting relationship, one that we can learn from as well. So we'll do that in a separate talk. But what's useful to know is that Ghattikara clearly lived at the time of Kassapa Buddha, was a very diligent supporter. He looked after his blind old parents, and that was one of the reasons he didn't ordain as a monk. And what we know is that he has come to visit Gautama Buddha. So what we can say is that this is an example that there are noble beings who have attainments, who live in between the time between Buddhas, and who exist even before the coming of the Buddha. Not just Ghattikara. Ghattikara is just one example, but there are probably many, many other examples because their lifespan is so long. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if they attain arahantship, that they immediately pass away. So as we saw from Hatthaka of Alavi, they are teaching and they are helping other living beings. What we have learned so far about the pure abodes is that they are very, very special places. They're places where you can learn the Dhamma, places where you can hear the Dhamma, and also teach the Dhamma and practice the Dhamma. And so if you're a non-returner who is reborn there, it is an easier place from there to actually finish off the path, to actually realize Nibbana. And for the arahants who live there, when they eventually pass away, then they too will not come back to the world. So when we reflect on these pure abodes, we need to reflect on them with utmost reverence and honor, and to know that these noble beings, they are really superior to all living beings in the world. They have attainments and they have wisdom, and they have let go of so much. And so when you think about them, you think about how great they are, how superior they are in terms of their Dhamma knowledge and practice and realization, but also in the fact that they are very, very great. And so we're going to look at Brahmä Sahampati as the final noble individual looking at these pure abodes. We learn a bit of his story in the Sahampati Brahma Sutta. This is Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 48, discourse number 57. And many of these suttas where Brahmä Sahampati appears, you see this unique relationship that he has with Gautama Buddha. He is welcome to come and speak out in front of the Buddha, and the Buddha never corrects him, unlike with other devas and Brahmas. Buddha never corrects Brahmä Sahampati, And Brahmä Sahampati has a very unique role because we know that he is the one that invited the Buddha to teach after his enlightenment. And we also know that Brahmä Sahampati is someone that often comes to visit the Buddha to encourage him, to support him, to endorse what he has to say, and also to come to inform the Buddha of certain things as well. So let's read a little from the sutta, and it says, on the occasion the Blessed One was dwelling at Uruvela on the bank of the Naranjara river at the foot of the goat herd's banyan tree, just after becoming fully enlightened. Then, while the Blessed One was alone in seclusion, a reflection arose in his mind thus: the 5 faculties, when developed and cultivated, have the deathless as their destination, the deathless as their goal. What 5? And so he mentions the faculty of conviction, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. So we briefly looked at this earlier on. Brahmä Sahampati, then knowing the mind of the Buddha, he comes from the pure abodes to appear before the Buddha, and then he respectfully arranges his robe. He extends his joined hands in reverential salutation, so he pays homage to the Buddha, and then he makes a statement. So he says to the Buddha, so it is, Blessed One, so it is, Fortunate One, Venerable Sir, the 5 faculties when developed and cultivated, and then he goes on and repeats what the Buddha has said. Brahmä Sahampati then says to the Buddha, once in the past, Venerable Sir, I lived a spiritual life under the perfectly enlightened one, Kassapa. There they knew me as the bhikkhu Saggakathaṁ. By having developed and cultivated these same 5 faculties, Venerable Sir, I eliminated desire for sensual pleasures, and thus with the breakup of the body after death, I was reborn in a good destination, in the Brahma world. There they know me as Brahmä Sahampati. So it is, Blessed One, so it is, Fortunate One. I know this, I see this, how these 5 faculties, when developed and cultivated, have the deathless as their destination, the deathless as their final goal. So we see an example where he has read the mind of the Buddha and has come to present himself to the Buddha and to actually endorse the Buddha's words. And in this case, he's offered a bit of information to us about his past. He lived at the time of Kassapa Buddha. At that time, he cultivated this practice of developing the 5 spiritual faculties, the indriyas, and he was able to eliminate the desire for sensual pleasures. That means he has developed certain path and fruit. I guess what's really interesting is his last statement is when he has said, I know this, I see this, how these 5 faculties, when developed and cultivated, have the deathless as their destination and final goal. So he is actually telling us, because when you know and see, this has a very complete meaning in the Buddha's teachings. It means that you are an arahant. And as we know, when you complete and fulfill the 5 spiritual faculties, Buddha declares you an arahant. We know from the suttas that Brahmä Sahampati has very strong abilities. So you read accounts where he's come to tell the Buddha about where someone has been reborn. So a couple of examples that come to mind are Devadatta. He came and told the Buddha about Devadatta, where he was reborn in the Avicii hell. He also came to talk about Kokalika, who was also someone that followed Devadatta, and how he was also reborn in a bad destination. And so he has all these different abilities. But at the same time, he had this ability to know that there were saggakathaṁs in the world, like trainees, walking the path, and whether people had entered the stream, and also about arahants, he could tell. And so it's not an ordinary person that is able to do that. So Brahmä Sahampati in the Anägämi Sutta, this is in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 6, discourse number 13, he comes to see the Blessed One and pays homage to him, and he actually talks about the abundance of people that are practicing and have attained spiritual path and fruit. So he says, one should resort to remote lodgings, practice for release from the fetters, but if one does not find delight there, guarded and mindful dwell in the Sangha. Walking for alms from family to family, faculties guarded, alert, mindful, one should resort to remote lodgings, freed from fear, liberated in the fearless. So he's talking about Nibbana. Where terrible serpents glide, where lightning flashes and the sky thunders, in the thick of darkness of the night, there sits a bhikkhu devoid of terror, for this has actually been seen by me. It is not merely hearsay. Within a single spiritual life, 1,000 have left death behind. So he's talking about arahants here. There are 500 more trainees, and 10 times a tenfold 10. All have entered the stream, never returning to the animal realm. As for the other people who remain, who to my mind partake of merit, I cannot even number them for fear of speaking falsely. So he's talking about those that have attained non-return, those that have entered the stream, and those that are walking this path. And so he can't even give a number because he does not want to speak an untruth. So you can see he has very, very good sila. So quite remarkable when you hear Brahmä Sahampati actually speaking out in verse. Even from the last sutta, we can experience part of the joy that Brahmä Sahampati is conveying in his verses. He's joyful when people come to the path, when they realize path and fruit. And there's something about these noble beings that we can understand through Brahmä Sahampati, that these noble beings have a lot of loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And there's a lot that we can learn from that, as well as respect. And when it comes to Brahmä Sahampati in particular, because he was the one that invited the Buddha to teach, and there are a number of different accounts, even during the life of the Buddha, where Brahmä Sahampati came to back him up, came to encourage to continue to teach, it's for that that we owe the gratitude to Brahmä Sahampati. He's a very, very unique and wonderful noble being. And he has so much reverence towards Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And so there's this sutta called the Gaurava Sutta, where the Buddha is talking about who he can look up to or what he can give honor to. And he contemplates this, and then he comes to the understanding that he can honor the Dhamma, because there is nobody else in the world that is superior to the Buddha. And so then Brahmä Sahampati comes from the pure abodes, and he says to the Buddha, after paying respects to the Buddha, he says, the Buddhas of the past, the future Buddhas, and he who is the Buddha now, removing the sorrow of many, all have dwelt, will dwell, and dwell, deeply revering the true Dhamma. For the Buddhas, this is the natural law. Therefore, one desiring his own good, aspiring for spiritual greatness, should deeply revere the true Dhamma, recollecting the Buddha's teachings. And so we can end our session with Brahmä Sahampati's words, his affirmation of what the Buddha has said, and we can look very kindly with great respect to the pure abodes and the noble beings of the pure abodes. We can end our session here. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you well, young friends. Teruan Saranai.